Welcome to Disaster Tales. No more sleep today, boss. No more sleep today, boss. Good morning, or good evening to you, boss. This is your brother Disaster. And today, this is your favorite show, or what's about to become your favorite show, on your favorite digital radio station, or the one that's gonna be your favorite real soon. Here, it's Unbound Horror. Whether it's summer or winter, our winter season never ends. Whether you're listening from the US, the UK, or Canada, it doesn't matter, we're all one family here, boss. Whether you're in your 40s, 50s, 60s, or 70s, you and I are brothers and friends. Even if this is your first time listening, your presence here was meant to be. We all share that spirit of adventure, we're all young wherever horror and adventure find us. And one final piece of advice. If true stories and everything that comes with them scare you, step out, this isn't the place for you. Because here, we buckle up for the fear. Before we turn the volume all the way up. This is Disaster on the Radio, boss. Let's roll. The air down in that stone crypt didn't just smell like winter, boss. It smelled like old sulfur, burnt tallow, and the thick, suffocating reek of dead candle grease that had baked into the porous limestone walls of the Institute of Forensic Medicine for over a century, clinging to my throat like a coat of toxic ash that choked off my breath and burned my bronchial tubes with every agonizing inhalation. Lyon was freezing that night in January 1979. Outside, high above the damp masonry ceiling, a relentless, freezing rain was hammering against the cobblestones of the old quarter, turning the French gutters into rushing black rivers of slush and freezing mud that clawed violently against the foundations like starving fingers trying to rip the stones apart, shaking the structural integrity of the ancient building. But down in the sub-basement archive, 2 floors below street level where they kept the paperwork and the cold storage, the rain didn't sound like water. It sounded like heavy lead shot rolling across a tin roof, a steady, maddening drumbeat that vibrated right through the thick stone floor and up into the heels of my boots, sending agonizing shivers straight through my aching spine and rattling my teeth in my jaw with a force that threatened to crack them. I sat alone at a heavy oak table scarred with cigarette burns and chemical stains. In front of me, a single tall church candle was burning down into its own pool of yellow grease, casting a pale, sickly light that barely reached the edges of the room and left the surrounding darkness thick, oppressive, and hostile, pressing against my eyeballs with actual physical weight, suffocating my capacity to think or breathe. A soft, continuous crackle of the cotton wick burning away, accompanied by a sudden pop and sizzle, pierced the absolute silence of the vault like a needle through raw nerve endings. The only sound inside the vault was the continuous, agonizing destruction of the cotton wick consuming itself, accompanied by the sharp, acrid smell of melted wax rising up into my nose every time the draft shifted from the iron ventilation grate, threatening to choke out my lungs with its poisonous fumes. My job wasn't glamorous, boss. I didn't wield a scalpel. I didn't dictate autopsy findings or examine fractured bone tissue beneath a brass microscope. My title at the Institute was simple, Sealer of Records. When a John Doe was pulled out of the canals or a body turned up in a locked cellar with no identification and too many unanswered questions, the judicial police sent the final reports and biological sample containers down to my desk before dawn. My task was absolute and manual: take the small copper spoon, melt the blood-red sealing wax over the open flame, pour the thick crimson liquid across the grooved rims of the heavy glass specimen jars, and press the massive iron seal bearing the crest of the Institute straight into the cooling wax with bone-crushing force. It was a legal guarantee, boss. A certification that the container had been hermetically locked and would never, under any circumstance, be opened again until it reached a judge's chambers in the dark heart of the judicial system, sealing away secrets that should have stayed buried forever, trapping horrors that defied human understanding. I picked up a copper spoon, resting its curved belly over the tip of the church candle flame. The metal began to tarnish instantly, turning a dull, coppery black as the heat bit into the brass with vicious intensity, radiating a fierce, stinging heat that scorched my fingertips and blistered the skin. Inside the spoon, a solid cube of deep, carmine-red sealing wax began to soften, its hard edges sweating a glossy, viscous crimson syrup that smelled faintly of pine resin and old dust, bubbling slowly like boiling blood over an open fire, emitting a sickly, suffocating vapor that warped the air around it. The clock on the damp stone wall behind me clicked past 2:30 in the morning, boss. The dead hour. The hour when the city above us was completely asleep, and the only things awake down in the dark were the files, the wax, and whatever the courts didn't want the daylight to touch, watching me from the absolute shadows with an unblinking, predatory gaze that pierced straight through my soul and held me paralyzed in a grip of frozen terror. The wax in the copper spoon didn't melt the way it was supposed to, boss. Instead of turning into a smooth, uniform syrup that poured like warm honey, it bubbled up from the center in thick, irregular lumps, spitting tiny, invisible droplets of hot crimson grease across the back of my hand, searing my flesh with sudden, blistering stings that burned straight down to the bone and left my skin smoking in the freezing air. I didn't flinch. You stop flinching at small burns after your third winter down in the stone crypts of Lyon, when the damp gets into your knuckles and every movement feels like bending dry twigs, fracturing stiff joints in a silent display of grim endurance that mocked my own failing body. I kept the spoon balanced steadily over the tip of the church candle flame, watching the flame twist and distort as a fresh gust of wind slammed against the heavy oak doors at the top of the spiral stone stairs, 5 levels above my head, vibrating through the masonry with the terrifying force of an oncoming tempest. A heavy, muffled impact of thick wood slamming against stone echoed down through the vertical shaft like a distant blow from a sledgehammer, rattling the dust from the ancient rafters. The sound of the freezing rain hitting the street outside didn't stop, it grew heavier, a relentless, deafening roar that made the dust motes hanging in the candlelight dance in ragged, frantic circles, trapped within an atmosphere of growing, claustrophobic dread that choked the air of any remaining oxygen. I shifted my gaze from the spoon to the edge of the oak table. There it sat. Case 88B. A heavy, cylindrical glass specimen jar, roughly the size of a man's forearm, sealed with a thick rubber gasket and a grooved metal screw cap that looked like it had been salvaged from the bottom of an industrial vat down by the Rhone River docks, radiating an aura of profound, unholy sickness that made the hair on my arms stand on end. There was no paperwork clipped to it. No index card detailing a name, an age, or a district number. Just a blank white linen label stuck to the side of the glass, yellowing around the edges from age or moisture, with a single word written in harsh, jagged black ink, unclaimed. Inside the jar, suspended in a cloudy, amber-tinted preservative fluid that looked suspiciously thick, like strained honey mixed with old bilge water, something dark and formless drifted slowly back and forth, twisting in unnatural contortions that defied the laws of anatomy. Every time the heavy oak doors at the top of the stairs rattled in their stone frame, the fluid inside the jar swirled. A slow, lazy rotation that sent tiny air bubbles clinging to the inner walls of the glass, popping one by one with a microscopic, silent fury that seemed to mock the fragile boundary keeping the contents contained within its glass prison. I pulled the copper spoon away from the flame. The red wax inside had turned a deep, bruised crimson, so dark it looked almost black in the flickering yellow light of the single church candle, absorbing the illumination like a pool of dried gore waiting for a sacrifice. I leaned forward, my elbows resting on the scarred wood of the desk, and brought the spoon closer to the rim of the glass jar. The smell hit me then, cutting right through the familiar scent of burning tallow and sulfur with vicious, suffocating clarity. It wasn't the clean, sharp chemical bite of formalin that we used downstairs in the dissection suites. It smelled like old, unwashed wool left in a damp cellar for 20 years, rotting slowly in an environment devoid of air or light, breeding a toxic mold that clung to the senses. It smelled like cold river mud, stagnant water, and the heavy, copper-rich reek of something organic that had been sealed away from the light of the sun for far too long, boss, exuding a miasma of ancient death that coated the back of my throat in a sickening, metallic film that made me gag silently into the dark. My fingers felt stiff inside the cold air of the vault, locked in a semi-paralyzed grip of absolute dread. I held the copper spoon steady over the grooved metal lid of the glass container, tilting the edge just a fraction of an inch, waiting for the first heavy drop of red wax to slide over the lip and seal the mouth of the jar forever, trapping whatever hideous secret lurked within its murky depths for all eternity while the shadows around my desk closed in like tightening nooses. The first drop didn't fall clean, boss. Instead of sliding smoothly over the edge of the copper spoon the way it always did when I was sealing routine property inventories or routine coroner's transcripts, the thick crimson syrup clung to the lip of the metal with a stubborn, parasitic tenacity that defied gravity and reason, writhing like a living sinew refusing to sever as it tore against the hardened metal edge. It stretched out into a thin, trembling thread of dark red wax, vibrating with a high-frequency shudder that made my fingers itch right down to the bone, sending agonizing waves of electric pins and needles up through my forearm that crippled my grip and sent hot shivers of dread down my spine, paralyzing my nervous system with sudden, blinding agony. Drop. It landed dead center on the grooved metal lid of the glass specimen jar with a wet, heavy thud that reverberated through the hollow chamber of the container like a hammer striking a coffin lid from the inside, shaking the entire workbench. It didn't spread out into a neat, circular pool. It sat there, dome-shaped and viscous, retaining a dull, oily sheen under the flickering yellow light of the church candle, throwing off a sharp, biting reek of heated pine resin and old sulfur that stung the back of my throat and made my eyes water behind my strained eyelids, choking out my breath and filling my lungs with an ash-like toxicity that burned like swallowed coals. I tipped the spoon a little further, my wrist held steady over the glass, ready to let the second and third drops finish the ring around the screw cap. That was when I noticed the surface of the wax. It wasn't cooling. Red sealing wax exposed to the freezing air of a January crypt in Lyon usually formed a dull gray skin within 3 seconds, hardening into brittle glass by the time you reached for the iron seal, fracturing clean under pressure. This wax didn't skin over. It stayed glossy, wet, and dark, bubbling gently from the inside out with tiny, microscopic craters that popped without a sound, exuding a pulsing, unnatural warmth that radiated outward like an open-wound weeping infected fluid in the freezing dark, contaminating the surrounding air with a foul, sickening heat. And right beneath those tiny bubbles, the thick crimson liquid started to sink. Not rolling down the sides of the metal lid, boss. It was being drawn downward. Drawn straight into the tiny, hairline microfractures of the grooved screw cap with a steady, rhythmic pulse, as if something inside the sealed glass jar was taking a long, deep, desperate breath through the very metal threads meant to keep it locked away from the world, drinking the blood-red wax down into its dark, lightless interior with an insatiable, ravenous hunger that devoured every drop of substance. I stopped tilting the spoon. I froze, my hand suspended 2 inches above the glass, my eyes locked on that sinking pool of red wax while my heart hammered frantically against my ribs like a trapped bird beating itself to death against cage bars in a frenzy of absolute panic that threatened to burst my chest wide open. The church candle on the oak table gave a sudden, violent flicker, its yellow flame stretching upward into a tall, thin needle of blue before dropping down to a microscopic ember that barely illuminated the damp stone blocks of the vault behind me, plunging the corners into absolute, swallowing blackness that seemed to crawl across the floor like a living entity eager to swallow me whole. In that sudden drop of light, the cloudy, amber-tinted preservative fluid inside case 88B swirled hard. The dark, formless shape floating in the center didn't drift anymore. It turned. It turned right toward the glass wall facing my desk, pressing itself flat against the interior surface with a dull, wet thud that sent a tiny, spiderweb fracture shooting straight across the thickness of the glass, boss, threatening to burst the container wide open and spill its unholy contents straight across my desk to drag me down into the abyss with it in a final, suffocating embrace of eternal darkness from which there was no possible escape. The spiderweb fracture didn't spread across the glass by itself, boss. It was hit from the inside with a vicious, sudden violence that sent shockwaves through the heavy desk and rattled the metal instruments. A sharp, precise impact, asterisk tink, tink, tink asterisk, delivered by something hard and narrow that struck the inner surface of the specimen jar with the dry, deliberate cadence of a human fingernail tapping against a windowpane on a freezing winter midnight, sending microscopic shivers of glass dust raining down into the viscous fluid below like falling sleet while the whole container trembled on the wood. I didn't move. My hand was still holding the copper spoon a few inches above the metal lid, the remaining red wax cooling and thickening into a dull, jagged crust against the brass lip while my frozen fingers refused to obey any command from my paralyzed brain, locked in a spasm of sheer, unadulterated horror that felt like an iron vice clamping down on my nervous system and squeezing the life from my veins. The sound echoed through the stone crypt with an unnatural clarity, cutting right through the steady, maddening drumbeat of the freezing rain hammering against the cobblestones high above the Institute of Forensic Medicine like an executioner's mallet pounding against a scaffold in a silent courtyard, demanding a toll in blood. Tink, tink. It wasn't a random settling of the glass. It was rhythmic. It was a summons, delivered from the dark, amber-tinted preservative fluid where that formless shape was pressed flat against the transparent wall right in front of my face, demanding entry into the waking world with horrifying, malignant intent that made my blood run instantly cold and turned my muscles to ice. I lowered the copper spoon slowly onto the wooden table, my fingers stiff and aching from the damp cold that seemed to be seeping straight out of the limestone blocks and into my marrow, freezing every joint in my hand into a state of agonizing stiffness that made my bones feel brittle and ready to shatter under pressure. The church candle flickered again, its yellow flame leaning sideways as a sudden, freezing draft swept across the floor, carrying with it a wave of air so foul it made my eyes water and my stomach heave with violent nausea that burned the lining of my throat raw, forcing bitter acid into my mouth. It didn't smell like the chemical preservatives we used downstairs. It smelled like old river mud dredged up from the bottom of the Rhone, mixed with the heavy, sweetish rot of unwashed wool and the metallic tang of old blood left to dry on a stone floor, choking the air of any remaining oxygen and turning my breath to ash while suffocating my lungs in a grip of utter despair. I leaned forward, my face inches from the glass cylinder, and stared into the cloudy amber liquid, trapped beneath an unseen gaze that pierced straight through my skull and paralyzed my vocal cords in a silent shriek of absolute terror. The shape inside had shifted. The darkness that had looked like a formless mass of tissue moments before was resolving itself into something far more precise, far more deliberate, taking on an anatomical horror that defied all natural laws of death and decay. A human hand. Not a living hand with warm skin and flexible joints, but a pale, waterlogged appendage stripped of its outer layers, the skin bleached white and translucent like wet parchment paper, pressed flat against the inner wall of the jar with the fingers spread wide open in a grotesque posture of eternal suffering that clawed against reality. The tips of those fingers were caked in a dark, blackened silt that drifted off into the amber fluid in tiny, swirling clouds, like smoke settling underwater, polluting the preservation fluid with particles of decayed corruption that writhed like living parasites in the chemical soup. And right in the center of the palm, pressed hard against the glass where the spiderweb fracture met the metal screw cap, was a jagged, circular scar, a brand burned deep into the flesh in the shape of an old judicial seal, boss, pulsing with a faint, unholy heat that threatened to melt the very glass containing it and drag my soul straight down into the lightless abyss of eternal damnation. The pale, waterlogged hand didn't stay pressed against the glass, boss. After that final, sharp tap that spiderwebbed the inner surface of the thick glass specimen jar, the elongated fingers curled inward one by one with agonizing slowness, dragging across the transparent wall with a dry, squeaking friction that set my teeth on edge and made the dental fillings in my jaw ache with a sudden, throbbing pain that radiated straight through my skull like a driving iron spike, completely shattering my last shred of composure and leaving my mind adrift in a dark sea of raw, Blinding panic. Skrt. The heavy, blackened silt caked deep beneath the water-bloated fingernails drifted away in thick, muddy tendrils, polluting the amber-tinted preservative fluid and turning it into a sickly, opaque brown that completely obscured whatever else was floating in the center of the container in a thick veil of absolute murk, hiding ancient atrocities best left unseen by mortal eyes. I didn't step back. My heavy boots felt fused to the damp, freezing stone floor of the underground vault, locked permanently in place by a sudden, overwhelming surge of cold terror that froze the blood right inside my veins and left my legs feeling like hollow tubes of lead anchored deep into the foundation of the earth, heavy and entirely unresponsive to the frantic commands screaming from my terrified brain. My wide, straining eyes were locked entirely on that grooved metal screw cap. The red sealing wax I had poured just moments ago, the thick, viscous crimson syrup that was supposed to harden rapidly into an impenetrable legal barrier, wasn't sitting on top of the grooved lid anymore. It was gone. Not melted away by heat, boss. Drawn down. Every single drop of the hot, bubbling wax had been sucked straight down into the microscopic threads of the metal cap, disappearing completely into the dark recesses of spirits and screw seams like water soaking into a dry linen rag with an unnatural, ravenous speed that defied every known law of physics, chemistry, and human logic. And right out of those tiny metal gaps, a thin, faint hiss began to rise. It wasn't the sound of compressed air escaping safely from a pressurized industrial container. It was a wet, rattling wheeze, pulling oxygen through a collapsed throat packed tight with river mud and stagnant water, hot and foul despite the freezing temperature of the sub-basement, carrying the suffocating stench of open graves and forgotten rot straight into my lungs with every passing second. Asterisk H. KKKKK, asterisk. The lone church candle on the heavy oak table gave a violent shudder. The yellow flame didn't just flicker or dance this time, it stretched upward into a thin, desperate spire of blue before snapping out entirely, plunging the cold stone crypt into an absolute, pitch-black darkness that felt heavy and physical, pressing against my eyeballs with actual crushing weight that stole the remaining breath from my body. In the sudden, total dark, the sound of the freezing rain hammering against the iron-grated cobblestones 5 levels above our heads seemed to vanish completely, replaced by an absolute, suffocating silence that was broken only by the sound of something shifting heavily inside the glass cylinder on the edge of the desk. I wanted to run, boss. I wanted to push away from the oak table, turn around blindly, and sprint toward the spiral stone stairs, beating my fists against the heavy oak doors until the night watchman hauled me up out of this underground tomb into the living air of the city. Instead, my right hand twitched. My fingers, stiff and aching from the damp cold, tightened instinctively around the wooden handle of the copper sealing spoon, the cold brass biting hard into my palm as the air around me turned instantly frigid, dropping so fast that my breath billowed out in thick, white clouds of steam, instantly freezing into tiny, glittering crystals against the stubble of my chin, boss, waiting in the freezing dark for whatever was waking up to take its next breath. The absolute pitch blackness inside that stone crypt didn't feel empty, boss. It felt brutally crowded, packed tight with an agonizing, dead air pressure that violently crushed against my collapsing ribcage like a massive hydraulic vise, making every desperate, rattling attempt to drag a meager scrap of oxygen into my burning lungs feel like swallowing fistfuls of jagged dry dust mixed with microscopic shards of broken glass, entirely clogging my torn windpipe with an invisible, suffocating weight that refused to lift, threatening to instantly rupture my swollen veins and permanently paralyze my violently pounding heart in a cage of pure terror. In the complete absence of the church candle's flame, my bloodshot eyes strained frantically against the suffocating dark, trying desperately to find the boundaries of the oak desk, the damp, weeping stone walls, or the heavy iron door at the foot of the winding spiral stairs. There was nothing. Just the smell, that unbearable, throat-tearing reek of old river mud, rotting wool, and stagnant water that had grown so dense and foul it coated the inside of my esophagus like congealed grease, refusing to wash away despite the bitter, acidic saliva pooling violently in my mouth and making me gag repeatedly on my own rising panic while my stomach heaved in helpless, agonizing revulsion. And then, right in front of me, across the narrow span of the wooden table, something gave off a faint, agonizingly dull glow. It wasn't yellow light. It wasn't the warm, flickering orange of a burning wick. It was a pale, phosphorescent blue shimmer, faint, sickly, and pulsing with a diseased, parasitic rhythm, radiating directly from the grooved metal lid of Case 88B. Under that spectral illumination, the glass specimen jar looked transparent again, casting long, grotesquely distorted shadows across the scarred wood of the desk like skeletal fingers slowly reaching out to wrap around my throat. Inside the jar, the preservative fluid was no longer cloudy or brown. It had cleared completely, turning as transparent as mountain spring water, revealing the horrific object suspended in the exact center of the cylinder. It wasn't a hand anymore. It was a human face, pressed so violently hard against the interior glass that the nose and lips were painfully flattened into pale, bloodless smears of torn tissue against the transparent wall, distorting human features into a nightmarish mask of absolute, everlasting agony. The eyes were blown wide open. Two milky, cataract-filmed globes that didn't reflect the blue light, yet seemed to look straight through the glass, straight through the absolute darkness, and straight into the center of my forehead with an accusing, ancient malice that paralyzed my soul. The unhinged jaw hung slack inside the fluid, tearing open in a silent, eternal scream that released a tiny cluster of air bubbles. Glop, glop. They rose slowly through the water, breaking against the underside of the metal screw cap just as the heavy iron seal lying beside the jar, the official brass stamp bearing the crest of the Institute of Forensic Medicine, began to agonizingly change. The solid iron handle of the seal didn't stay cool, boss. A sudden, blinding, searing heat radiated viciously from the metal, turning the bronze surface from dull gray to a glowing, incandescent orange that hissed loudly as it baked deep into the wood of the table, charring a deep, smoking circle right into the scarred oak while a thin, acrid wisp of gray smoke curled up into the freezing air of the crypt, boss. The glowing, incandescent orange of the iron seal didn't cool down, boss. It burned brighter with a demonic fury, casting a harsh, chemical blue and fiery red strobe across the damp limestone blocks of the sub-basement, turning every shifting shadow into a long, writhing, barbed claw that aggressively reached out from the pitch-black corners of the vault to slowly drag me deeper into total madness, choking every remaining instinct of self-preservation out of my mind and crushing my spirit beneath an invisible mountain of pure, unadulterated dread. The smell of scorched oak was thick now, overwhelmingly sharp and biting, mingling with the suffocating, heavy reek of rotting river mud and boiling tallow until my eyes watered with burning tears and my chest screamed in agonizing fire with every half-formed, ragged breath that tore at my raw throat like sandpaper, robbing me of the very air I desperately needed to stay conscious. On the desk, Case 88B sat dead center in the middle of that chaotic, blinding light, radiating a palpable aura of dread that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand rigidly on end while my pulse hammered frantically against my temples like a trapped animal beating against iron bars. The face pressed against the interior glass, that pale, waterlogged visage with its milky, cataract-filmed eyes and flattened nose, wasn't just staring anymore. It was slowly, sickeningly smiling. The slack, unhinged jaw was parting wider with a sickening, audible pop of decaying cartilage, the corners of the mouth stretching back toward the glass in a grotesque, silent grimace that exposed the rotten, black, stained teeth behind the swollen gray lips, mocking my utter helplessness and daring me to look away as the terror consumed my sanity piece by agonizing piece. Click. The sound came directly from the grooved metal screw cap of the jar, piercing my ears like a poisoned needle and driving a sharp spike of terror straight through my brain, vibrating painfully inside my skull. It didn't sound like metal turning smoothly on thread. It sounded like human bone snapping under the brutal weight of a heavy boot, echoing with the cruel resonance of an executioner's drop in the dead of night. The thick red sealing wax that had been sucked down into the microfractures moments before was being forced back out in a torturous struggle, bubbling up around the rim in a violent, frothing eruption of boiling crimson sludge that hissed maliciously and spat tiny, blistering droplets of hot grease across the scarred wood of the table, burning tiny black pits into the ancient timber. I desperately wanted to pull my hands back. I wanted to tear my trembling fingers away from the edge of the desk and leap backward into the safety of the dark, fleeing like a coward before the horror consumed me entirely. My muscles were completely locked, violently paralyzed by a freezing, numbing weight that had crept up from the stone floor, locking my joints and anchoring my heels to the ground as if my boots had been poured full of molten lead, turning my lower body into dead weight. My right hand, still gripping the wooden handle of the copper sealing spoon, began to drift forward against my absolute will, moving with a horrifying autonomy that defied every law of my body and every command of my terrified brain. I wasn't telling it to move, boss. The muscles in my forearm were twitching viciously under the skin, contracting in a series of sharp, rhythmic, agonizing spasms that violently pulled my wrist toward the glowing iron seal lying just inches from the smoking circle in the oak table. The heat radiating from the bronze stamp was intense now, scorching the air out of my lungs and turning my cold sweat into stinging salt that trickled down blindingly into my eyebrows, burning my skin with an unbearable intensity that made my flesh crawl. And right as my trembling fingertips brushed against the smoking metal handle of the seal, a sound echoed from the spiral stone stairs high above our heads, a heavy, resonant iron slam that shook the dust from the ceiling and signaled that the final lock had just been thrown from the outside, trapping me forever in the dark, boss. The heavy iron slam from the spiral stone stairs didn't just echo down through the 5 vertical tiers of ancient masonry, boss. It felt like a colossal, iron-shod sledgehammer swung by an invisible giant, striking the floorboards directly above my skull with a brutal, bone-shattering shockwave that sent a thick, choking cloud of dry, white lime dust sifting down from the vaulted brick ceiling to settle like a shroud of cold winter snow across my trembling shoulders and the clutter, scarred surface of the oak desk. The air vibrated with a long, agonizing metallic shriek, like a massive cathedral bell struck dead center by a jagged bolt of lightning, fading slowly into a suffocating, dead silence that pressed against my eardrums with a crushing physical weight. The heavy iron bolt at the top of the spiral stairwell dropped into place with finality, locking shut with the definitive snap of a trap closing on an animal's limb, sealing our fate in the dark. The outside world, the freezing rain lashing the cobblestones of Lyon, the damp quiet of the judicial police offices, and the warm, distant lights of the city above, was completely cut off from us. We were locked in for good, buried alive in stone. On the desk, the glowing, incandescent orange of the official institute seal was so blindingly bright it cast my shadow sharply against the damp limestone wall behind me, stretching it out into a distorted, jagged silhouette that looked like something pinned beneath the crushing weight of a collapsing mountain. The glass specimen jar, case 88B, was reacting violently to the closed bolt, trembling on its base as if possessed by a malignant fever. The pale face pressed flat against the interior glass was no longer smiling. The milk-white, cataract-filmed eyes had rolled back deep into the skull until only the sickly, blood-vessel-laced whites were visible, and the unhinged jaw was vibrating with a rapid, erratic shudder that made the murky preservative fluid inside the cylinder froth with tiny, violent bubbles. A low, electrical crackling began to hum deep within the thick glass, sounding like a live, stripped wire thrashing wildly against wet stone and spitting a flurry of invisible, stinging sparks that made my skin crawl with violent goosebumps. It wasn't a water sound anymore. It sounded like a mechanical telegraph key frantically tapping out an underwater distress signal in a forgotten, blasphemous code, driving a relentless, agonizing rhythm that beat directly against the inside of my skull like a woodpecker drilling into rotting timber. And then, the fluid level inside the jar began to rise on its own accord. Without any external source, without a funnel or a hand pouring liquid, the cloudy amber water swelled upward from the base, climbing past the metal screw cap, pushing against the boiling red sealing wax that had bubbled out around the rim. A sharp, angry hissing erupted from the glass, sounding like a nest of cornered vipers spitting boiling venom into the dark, filling the room with an unbearable, high-pitched squeal that grated on my nerves until I wanted to claw my own ears off. The hot crimson wax met the rising fluid, turning into a thick, purple sludge that ran down the exterior sides of the glass in long, weeping streaks of grease. I tried to scream, "Boss." I opened my mouth wide, straining my vocal cords until a sharp, tearing pain ripped across my throat, but no sound came out. The air in the sub-basement had grown so dense, so heavy with the reek of burning tallow, sulfur, and stagnant river mud, that it felt like trying to inhale liquid cement. My right hand, gripped by that same silent, bone-deep paralysis, reached out across the scorched circle in the oak table and closed its fingers around the incandescent bronze handle of the seal. The heat didn't just warm my skin. It bit straight through my palm, searing the flesh down to the bone with a sharp, blinding flash of white-hot agony that smelled unmistakably of singed hair and cooked meat, yet my fingers refused to let go, tightening their grip until the metal handle was embedded deep in the center of my hand. "Boss." The pain in my right palm didn't register as a clean, sharp scream, "Boss." It registered as a blinding flash of pure, radioactive white-hot light that exploded violently behind my eyes, turning the pitch-black corners of the sub-basement into a glaring, hallucinatory expanse of searing agony that scrambled my thoughts into a chaotic mess of panic and robbed me of any coherent reasoning, driving white-hot needles of torment deep into the cerebral cortex while my nerves shrieked in absolute revolt against the overwhelming violation. The bronze handle of the official institute seal had completely fused with the ruined skin of my hand, melting the flesh into the glowing metal like wax dripping down a lit candle in a relentless fire, charring the sinews and bubbling the moisture out of my fingers in an agonizingly slow process of biological corruption. When I desperately tried to jerk my arm back, forcing every ounce of desperate, trembling muscle fiber to pull away from the scorched oak table, the charred flesh of my palm stayed welded to the red-hot metal, tearing away with a dry, sickening rip like old parchment paper peeling off the surface of a red-hot kitchen stove, leaving a smoking trail of ruined skin and exposed nerve endings behind to blister in the open air. I crashed backward out of the wooden chair, tumbling awkwardly and kicking the heavy oak legs as I fell into the filth. My back slammed hard against the damp, freezing stone floor of the vault with a dull, hollow thud that violently knocked the remaining breath from my aching lungs, leaving me sprawled flat in the freezing dirt, gasping frantically for air that tasted entirely of liquid copper, heavy ash, and centuries of old decay, while my ribs throbbed with a dull, sickening ache. Above me, perched precariously on the edge of the scarred desk, Case 88B had suddenly stopped its violent vibrating, plunging the room into a stillness that felt far more terrifying than the motion, a heavy, suffocating pause that hung in the air like the executioner's blade suspended midair. The rising amber fluid inside the thick glass cylinder had reached the absolute top, pressing with crushing hydraulic force against the underside of the grooved metal lid until the heavy glass began to bulge outward dangerously under the immense, unnatural pressure, threatening to fracture at any fraction of a second. The face inside, that waterlogged, bloated visage with its milk-white, cataract-filmed eyes and horribly unhinged jaw, was no longer pressed against the front of the glass. It was suspended and floating freely in the dead center of the swirling liquid, rotating slowly like a magnetized compass needle finding true north, turning its dead, blind gaze directly downward to look straight into my eyes where I lay paralyzed on the stone floor, watching me with an ancient, fathomless malice that chilled my blood to absolute ice. And then, the air itself transformed into a terrifying, suffocating physical presence that pressed down on my chest with the weight of a collapsing ceiling, making every heartbeat feel like a hammer blow against my ribs, suffocating every lungful of air until I felt my chest cave inward under the invisible weight. The atmosphere was violently seized by a deep, chest-compressing vibration that rolled through the room like the low, grinding frequency of a massive iron vault door being forced open on ungreased, rusted hinges, accompanied by a heavy, droning hum that rattled my teeth and shook the marrow inside my bones, sending sickening shockwaves through the floorboards beneath me that vibrated straight up into my spine. All around the shadowed perimeter of the stone crypt, lined up neatly along the high wooden shelves where the historical records and biological samples of uncounted decades were stored in heavy glass and tin containers, the red sealing wax on every single jar began to fracture under an invisible, malicious pressure, splintering apart in slow, agonizing increments. The suffocating silence was violently torn apart by a sequence of sharp, explosive cracks resembling the close-range gunfire of an execution squad, immediately followed by the dry, brittle sound of hardened wax shattering into thousands of razor-sharp pieces that rained down across the stone floor like a sudden storm of blood-red hail, accompanied by the wet, aggressive hissing rush of volatile chemical preservatives bursting free from their shattered confines to choke the room in fumes of absolute terror, boss. The blood-red hail didn't stop with a single volley, boss. It turned into a torrential downpour of shattered wax that rained from the shelves with a continuous clatter, covering the damp stone floor in a knee-deep carpet of jagged shards that crunched beneath my boots, grinding into the raw meat of my ruined palm and sending searing white-hot agony straight up into my trembling shoulder. I was still sprawled out on my back against the freezing masonry, my right hand raised, the palm a smoking ruin where the seal had torn free from my flesh, leaving a crater of charred tissue that wept sluggish streams of blood. The air was unbreathable, thick with absolute terror. The simultaneous rupture of 1,000 specimen containers released a tidal wave of archival gases, a blinding mixture of century-old formalin, volatile alcohol, decaying animal tissue, and the choking reek of stagnant river mud dredged from the Rhone in 1979, carrying the heavy stench of things buried in the dark. It coated my lungs like cold grease. Every time I tried to drag oxygen into my chest, my throat constricted, forcing a dry, racking cough that tasted of liquid copper and bitter ash, tearing my vocal cords until I tasted my own internal bleeding. On the oak table above me, Case 88B had ceased its slow rotation, plunging the room into a heavier stillness. The glass cylinder was no longer bulging. The amber fluid inside had turned pitch black, a dense, light-absorbing void that swallowed the spectral glow and left the jar looking like a solid chunk of forged iron resting squarely in the center of the scarred desk, pulsating with a sickening heartbeat of its own. And then, the sound changed, twisting into something cruel. The low frequency of the limestone foundation shifting didn't fade, it rose in pitch, turning from a subterranean hum into a piercing shriek that sounded like thousands of steel wires pulled past their breaking point, tearing at my brain until I wanted to scream. Scree! The heavy oak table began to splinter under a crushing weight. Fine cracks raced across its scarred surface, branching outward from the scorched circle where the seal had burned its mark, until the center of the wood gave way with a loud groan and dropped straight down into the dark hollow of the base. Case 88B didn't fall. It hovered in mid-air, defying nature. Suspended over the ruined table, the black, opaque liquid inside began to boil without heat, throwing off thick, greasy bubbles that smacked against the interior glass with a dull, rhythmic thud that hammered against my skull. Thud, thud, thud. The metal screw cap on top began to unscrew itself in an impossible display of malice. It didn't turn by human hand. It spun on invisible threads with blinding speed, backing off the glass neck one rotation at a time, accompanied by a sharp screech of friction that set my teeth on edge and made my skull feel like it was splitting down the center. Arr! I dragged myself backward across the floor, my heels carving desperate tracks through the crimson shards, my back slamming hard against the solid stone base of the spiral staircase with an impact that rattled every bone in my body. My fingers clawed frantically at the lower masonry, searching for a gap, a handle, an iron bolt, anything to pull myself up out of this tomb while my fingernails tore away and stained the stone red. There was nothing. Just cold, porous limestone weeping winter moisture straight into the raw wounds of my hands. With a final, deafening crack that echoed like a pistol shot through the 5 subterranean levels, shattering the remaining silence into a million jagged pieces, the grooved metal screw cap popped completely off the top of Case 88B and spun away into the dark, lost beneath the sea of red wax shards. A geyser of dense, black mist erupted from the open mouth of the jar, hissing like an army of suffocating ghosts. It didn't dissipate into the air of the crypt, boss. It gathered itself together right above the ruined oak desk, twisting, coiling, and expanding into a massive, towering silhouette that scraped its shoulders against the vaulted stone ceiling, blotting out every shadow and staring down at me with two bottomless, milk-white eyes that held the absolute, freezing silence of the dead, sealing my doom in the dark, boss. The towering silhouette didn't just cast a shadow across the sub-basement, boss. It swallowed the room whole, expanding until its ragged shoulders scraped against the damp limestone of the vaulted ceiling, sending a continuous shower of gray lime dust and dried mortar sifting down like ash over my head. The air had turned into something heavy and solid, like breathing through a wet wool blanket soaked in river silt and stagnant industrial oil. Every breath burned my throat with the sharp, acidic sting of century-old formalin and scorched oak. I was jammed hard against the massive stone base of the spiral staircase, my fingernails dug so deep into the porous mortar that the skin beneath had torn, leaking thin lines of dark blood that instantly chilled in the freezing draft. On the ruined oak desk 3 yards away, Case 88B sat open to the dark. The metal screw cap was gone, lost somewhere beneath the knee-deep carpet of shattered, carmine-red wax shards covering the floor like broken glass. And the mist, that dense, churning column of black vapor erupted from the jar, wasn't just hovering anymore. It was condensing. Droplets of heavy, oily moisture were coalescing out of the dark cloud, falling with a wet splatter onto the splintered wood before running in thick, viscous streams that pooled over the edge and dripped straight down into the void below. Plop, plop, plop. Each drop sounded less like water and more like lead weights hitting an iron plate. I couldn't look away, boss. My eyelids felt propped open with invisible wire, stretched wide and dry under the unblinking glare of whatever spectral energy was radiating from that towering mass. The silhouette took shape. Not the shape of a doctor, nor a police investigator, nor any nameless John Doe pulled from the freezing waters of the Rhone during that bitter winter of 1979. It wore the heavy, waterlogged wool coat of a man who had spent 40 years at the bottom of a locked gate, the fabric swollen and encrusted with pale gray river moss and blackened mud that dripped dark slime down onto the floorboards. The head sat crooked on the neck, tilted sharply to the left at an impossible, broken angle, as if the cervical vertebrae had been shattered by a heavy iron blow from behind. And the face, when the shifting black mist parted for a fraction of a second, was entirely blank. No nose. No lips. Just a smooth, pale expanse of water-bleached skin stretched tight over a skull that had no business holding form, perforated only by 2 wide, unblinking sockets filled with stagnant, milky white fluid that didn't reflect the sickly light. The thing took a step forward. The stone floor didn't creak, it groaned with a deep, subterranean vibration that traveled straight up through the soles of my boots and rattled the fillings in my jaw. Nietzsche. It stepped off the ruins of the oak desk, its mud-caked boots sinking deep into the sea of shattered red wax shards, crushing the brittle carmine fragments into a fine, blood-red powder that hissed against the soles of its shoes like live coals hitting ice. I tried to push myself further into the masonry. I threw my weight back against the solid stone wall, shoving my palms against the damp blocks until my arms shook with exhaustion, but the wall felt less like stone now and more like packed earth, cold, damp, and yielding slightly to the pressure of my spine, as if the foundations were dissolving back into raw riverbank mud. The figure stopped 5 feet away from me. The smell was unbearable now. It wasn't just dead fish and rotting wool, it was forgotten evidence, unsorted judicial files left to rot in flooded cellars, and unavenged names erased from city ledgers because courts found it easier to write unclaimed across a blank tag. The broken head tilted further, the wet wool collar brushing against the high stone wall with a dry, rasping sound. And from deep inside that formless chest cavity, from a throat packed solid with river silt, a voice began to rise. It wasn't a sound made by vocal cords, boss. It was dry parchment tearing in half. It was a heavy iron seal pressing down into hot, bubbling wax. "The record's still open, Gabriel," the voice scraped across the room, dry and rattling like coarse gravel sliding down an iron chute in the dead of winter. I looked down at my right hand. The palm was a raw, blackened crater where the bronze handle had fused with my flesh moments before. The skin was charred black around the edges, leaking a thin, clear serum that didn't freeze despite the biting cold. And right in the center of that ruined palm, the metal brand was glowing again, not with a bright, fiery orange, but with a dull, bruised crimson matching the wax scattered across the floor. The towering figure raised a heavy, water-swollen arm. The fingers, long, pale, and tipped with blackened, split nails, extended slowly toward my chest, pointing directly at the torn flesh of my palm with absolute, unyielding finality. The pale, water-swollen fingers didn't touch my chest, boss. They stopped a harrowing fraction of an inch away from the torn, smoking crater in my palm, hovering in the freezing, dead air of the sub-basement with a stillness so absolute that even the drifting specks of gray lime dust seemed to freeze mid-fall, hanging suspended like tiny, lifeless stars in a dead sky while the pressure in the room built to a crushing, skull-splitting crescendo that threatened to burst my eardrums from the inside out. The smell of river silt and old wool was so thick now it tasted like raw copper on the back of my tongue, heavy and metallic and freezing cold, coating my teeth and tongue in a greasy film of subterranean decay that made my stomach heave with violent, agonizing retching spasms that tore against my locked throat and squeezed tears of pure terror from the corners of my unblinking eyes. I didn't blink. My eyes were locked with agonizing precision on those long, split fingernails, watching a single, dark droplet of foul, stagnant water gather at the tip of the middle finger, hang there for a long, agonizing second that stretched out like an eternity of torture, and finally fall. Plop. It didn't hit the stone floor. It landed square in the dead center of the raw, charred flesh of my right palm, right over the glowing, bruised crimson brand of the Institute seal, sending a fresh, blinding wave of white-hot, radioactive shockwave straight into the center of my nervous system, making my spine lock rigid like an iron rod. There was no hiss. There was no steam. The cold drop simply vanished into the skin, sinking straight down into the marrow and bone with a sharp, electric jolt that shot all the way up my arm, locking my elbow in a vice grip of agony and forcing my fingers to curl inward until my hand formed a tight, rigid fist around the phantom heat of the metal. The towering figure in the waterlogged coat didn't move away. It stepped closer, sliding forward without a single sound of footfall, until the pale, featureless expanse of its water-bleached face was inches from my own, filling my entire field of vision with that smooth, terrifying blankness that held no eyes, no expression, and no mercy, radiating a cold so deep it froze the very thoughts inside my skull into jagged blocks of ice. And then, the sub-basement went dead, suffocatingly silent. The heavy, relentless drumming of the freezing rain against the cobblestones 5 levels above our heads stopped entirely, cut off instantaneously as if the world itself had ceased to turn on its axis and reality had fractured. The low, subterranean grinding of the limestone foundation died away into a sickening, vacuum-like quiet that made my chest ache for noise. Even the draft through the iron ventilation grate vanished, leaving the air completely motionless, trapped in a timeless, suffocating vacuum where nothing decayed, nothing burned, and nothing grew old, holding us both in a suspended animation of pure, unadulterated terror. The figure slowly opened its mouth, that dark, silent tear in the pale tissue beneath the flat plane of the nose, and let out one final breath. It wasn't air. It was a thin, dry stream of crimson sealing wax, pouring out in a continuous, viscous ribbon that flowed over my chin, down my throat, and straight across the lapel of my jacket, searing my skin with a dull, burning heat that quickly hardened into a solid, impenetrable shell of blood-red resin that locked my body straight against the stone wall like a prisoner entombed in a crypt. I tried to scream, "Boss," but my jaws were frozen shut beneath the rapidly hardening wax, my tongue pressed hard against the roof of my mouth as the resin crept upward to seal my lips in a permanent, suffocating gag that choked off my remaining oxygen. My eyes remained open, burning and bone-dry, staring out across the ruined vault as the figure slowly turned away, stepping backward through the knee-deep carpet of carmine shards until it dissolved back into the absolute shadows of the unlit back shelves, leaving me stranded in the dark. The single church candle on the broken oak desk didn't relight. The room didn't grow warm. The heavy iron bolt at the top of the spiral stairs stayed firmly thrown, holding the night outside while the clock on the damp stone wall clicked past 3 in the morning, and stayed right there, frozen between 1 second and the next, forever, boss.